Hi. Welcome to Esoterica and Nonsense, a podcast where we discuss myths, legends, folk tales, fairy tales, supernatural phenomenon, and religions from around the world. I am your host, Annabelle. I am a pepper pie queen from the land of peppercorns, and I'm here on a Saturday. I have been such a lazy pepper. Oh my gosh, I'm not even gonna front. When the weather changes, I'm so tired. I'm so exhausted, and I have no regrets about that. It's a really nice day today. The winds have been very strong this morning. I'm in a very small, tiny room. There's barely any space. If we hear neighbors, if we hear wind, that's kind of part of the game today. I'm very, 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 very excited. I have not recorded in quite a time, and I miss it. And I want to talk more about magic, and I want to talk more about incredibly fascinating and obscure shit. Today, I have chosen to discuss Juniper. Why Juniper, do you ask? Well, little did I know until about a year ago, Juniper, and specifically juniper berries and juniper branches, have been used medicinally and in magical scenarios and magical rituals for thousands of years. Did you know that? Probably not. This is going to be a deep cut, an obscure cut, and I genuinely cannot wait. So, a little background here. Juniper, also known as the juniperus tree, is of the cypress family. It's coniferous. What is coniferous, you ask? That is such a great question. A coniferous tree is something that creates cones, like a pine cone, for example, and the branch/leaf style is not quite as basic as a regular leaf. They have more of like needles, little aromatic leaf needles. The juniper tree lives throughout the northern hemisphere from the Arctic Circle all the way into South Africa, and as well as parts of Western, Central, and Southern Asia, from Tibet to the mountains of the Central America. So basically, juniper trees grow all around the world. And for this very reason, they are a part of very many cultures. So, fun fact, the highest elevation that a juniper tree is known to grow is in the northern Himalayas in Tibet at the altitude of 16,100 feet. That is high elevation. In meters, that's 4,900 meters, okay? And a juniper tree can vary greatly in length. It can be between 60 feet and 130 feet. The female trees bear dark berries, and usually they're a dark blue, but sometimes they can be a red, brown, or orange. This is where it gets interesting, because the berries are where the juice, where the magic is contained. So today, I think most people know that juniper berries are used to make gin. And quite honestly, the origins of gin gin wasn't created as an alcohol to get wasted or to get lit. Originally, gin was created as a botanical concentrate used for religious rites and for medicinal rites. But we're going to get into that in a bit. Some of the oldest known uses of juniper stems back to Mesopotamian culture. The Mesopotamians believed that juniper oil could ward off evil spirits. And so it was used kind of as a smell to smudge the air. In ancient Syria specifically, Juniper was associated with the fertility goddess Ashera, also known as Astarte. I'm saying that with like an accent that I don't think applies to this area, but I don't want to say Astarte because it sounds like Astarte. If you know how to pronounce her name correctly, email in. So Ashera's temples were cleansed with the smoke of juniper branches before having rituals and rites there, because they believed that the smoke of the juniper would cleanse the air of evil spirits. Also, deep cut, in the Old Testament, a juniper tree with an angelic presence was the shelter of the prophet Elijah while he was hiding from Queen Jezebel and her soldiers. In this story, he naps under this juniper tree. He not only is escaping from Queen Jezebel's pursuit, but also at the time is contemplating stopping his career as a prophet because he found it too costly and too problematic. And so the story goes that after his nap, an angel from God woke him and fed him a cake baked on hot stones and gave him a jar of water. He directed Elijah to go to Horeb, which is the Mount of God, where he would receive another revelation. So in this story, the juniper tree acts as a symbolic aid to clairvoyance, which is actually repeated throughout many cultures and many pieces of history, that the juniper tree is associated with achieving clairvoyance. There's also a juniper tree mentioned in the tale of Jesus's parents, Mary and Joseph. The story goes that while Jesus was an infant, his parents were hiding from King Herod's soldiers. They hid under a juniper tree during their escape. And again, take what you will from that, but that's two biblical stories of juniper. Also, the Egyptians would actually use juniper oil. They would often rub it on bodies during the anointing process of the mummification rites. So they would rub bodies down with a mixture of oils, which included juniper berry oil. And also, when they were assembling tombs, they would often put baskets of juniper branches inside of the tombs. Get out of here. Juniper oil was often used in other Egyptian cosmetics and medicines, and specifically the Egyptians used juniper oil kind of as a cure-all. They used it for headaches, asthma, indigestion, tapeworm, aching joints, and sometimes specifically period cramps. There are records from 1500 BC of Egyptians using juniper berry oil for medicine. There's a myth of Osiris. At one point, he was dead for a short period of time and eventually resurrected. But while he was still dead, his brother Set had a sarcophagus made out of a juniper tree. How magical is that? Okay, before I continue on, what frustrates me when I read it, like when I do research into ancient medicinal practices, why in the day and age we live in are we using such concentrated drugs that are not so natural? I mean, almost all medicines that big pharmaceuticals make are plant derived, but they're so concentrated that they can create a lot of issues. And then we have like synthetic amphetamines and all this shit. But like, I've never heard of this. I didn't know that juniper oil had all of these properties, and believe me, there's even more. So just something to think about, guys. I think homeopathic remedies should be explored more, because I think they can do so much more without having to explore the more extreme options, or at least they should be entertained before the extreme options. Just saying. So the Romans also used juniper berries, and specifically the Romans used it to aid their digestion as well as flatulence issues. The Greeks were also known to eat juniper berries, and they would feed juniper berries to athletes, believing that they would have more physical stamina. In parts of ancient Central Europe, juniper was used to cure typhoid, cholera, dysentery, and parasite issues. And, speaking of which, the Egyptians were specifically known to have remedies for tapeworm that involved juniper berry and juniper berry oils. I think that should be explored too. You know what? Let's do a juniper cleanse. The natives of the Americas also have been recorded using juniper berries for a multitude of ailments, including tuberculosis, stomach ulcers, rheumatisms, cuts and wounds, and even people with diabetes. There were some tribes in the Americas that would actually make wood. No, wait. There were some tribes in the Americas that would actually make arrows and hunting bows out of the wood of the juniper trees. And I actually think that's really interesting because other cultures were associating them with expelling evil spirits. And so to also make weapons out of them, I feel like is very symbolic. So now we come to Scotland. This is a very pivotal global influence on gin, and specifically juniper. A better way to say it is a big influence on gin and its distribution around the world. So in Scotland, juniper was incredibly plentiful and wild. And for a long time, Scottish people were adding juniper berries to their whiskey, believing that it enhanced the medical properties of whiskey. Obviously, whiskey isn't medicinal, but they're not crazy for adding juniper to it. So the Scottish, for years, would pick a bunch of juniper, and they would sell the juniper berries to Dutch sailors who would distill it into gin and sell it in other parts of Europe. Very quickly, juniper was used to flavor different health-oriented alcoholic beverages all over Europe, specifically one in Holland and one in France and one in Belgium, but all parts of Europe were starting to add juniper to their alcoholic beverages. Now, in their defense, Europe, especially during the Dark Ages, but just in general, Europe has been known for having some pretty horrible hygiene awareness. And so in most countries in Europe for quite a long time, it was safer to drink alcohol than it was to drink water, because a lot of water was just so putrid and toxic. So some of these people were drinking ales and beers as their way to hydrate, which is fucked up, but here we are. So Europeans would often pair juniper berries with meat to aid with digestion, and also to aid with the gaminess of certain flavors. So there are many recorded dish of venison, which is deer meat, paired with a juniper berry like jam, or even just like juniper berries just next to it, which is really interesting. I've never heard of all this shit. So it's also said that the chemicals inside the juniper berries stimulate the uterine muscles to contract. So for this reason, juniper berries were used for women who are having really bad menstrual cramps, as it would kind of help them menstruate faster so that their pain would go away sooner. It was also used for women who were going to give birth, so it would induce labor and help them push the baby out. And also, people would use juniper berries to terminate unwanted pregnancies and have natural abortions. So in Europe in the Middle Ages, there was actually a euphemistic phrase which was referred to as, quote, giving birth under the savin tree. The savin meaning the juniper tree. So basically this euphemistic phrase referred to, like, if a woman gave birth under a juniper tree, you were really saying that a woman had an induced miscarriage, instead of actually, like, giving birth to a baby, which is so interesting. I just want to put it out there that abortions have been happening since the beginning of time. It is every woman's right to choose, and the earlier she can make the decision in the pregnancy, the least amount of suffering happens, and there's nothing wrong with a woman having control over her body and autonomy. And hopefully one day in the world, women will be allowed to do what they need to do with safety and options that allow them to not be controlled by other human beings of what they do with their body. But I also want to bring up that abortions are very much gate kept by governments. So even in a place where abortions are legal, you have to go and procure the medicine to get it. And I definitely think that that is great that we have some places have access to that. But I also think that I wish that there was more information about natural abortions and using plant medicine to have abortions. I wish that there was, abortion doulas that could help you have homeopathic remedies where you could be using natural things that are not chemical derived in labs and have a more natural process, because it can be really scary. And I, as someone who tries to avoid the doctor at all cost, I think that there should be more research, and specifically in women's health, and then more research in women's health referring to homeopathic remedies. Funnily enough, now I'm going to get on this whole fucking side tangent, but I actually learned last year that a lot of drug studies, diet studies, psychological studies, almost any study you can ever imagine scientifically, they are allowed to cut women out of the data pool because their bodies do not follow the same rhythms as men. And so because of that, they're considered outliers. But basically the female body has different hormone patterns that change every 4 to 8 days. And so this whole thing, like the circadian rhythm that they talk about, which is crucial to the human function, that is true, but it's really more people with penises that have a circadian rhythm because their hormone schedule is in a 24-hour cycle. So it's a lot more methodical from a 24-hour perspective, whereas the female cycle changes every week, and people who have vaginas are just slightly more nuanced in the way that their body works. And so because science has been so male dominated, they just couldn't really care less. And because of that, I think women have had to suffer from lack of information about how women's bodies work. And a lot of information about the reproductive system happened because white doctors were operating on women of color and literally slicing them open alive to just figure out how the uterus worked. And that's really fucked up. And it's just kind of another insight into how little men care about women's reproductive health or reproductive rights or safety. And I have done my own research on natural abortions and have found very little information on it, probably because I don't think they want people having their own abortions. But I will say that there have been many cultures that have been doing natural abortions for thousands of years, and we have lost a lot of information on natural remedies for all kinds of things. But there's a plant for everything, and I think we should at least entertain those ideas before medicating ourselves with things that may or may not work with our body chemistry and may or may not have been tested with other drugs. They don't often. Okay, anyway, I feel like I'm going on a long rant, but Juniper is fucking interesting, and I think we should study it more because I don't think I've ever heard of anyone who eats it or uses the oil. That's my point. So, most commonly, juniper was not used for building. Juniper wood specifically was almost never used for any kind of like what's the word I'm looking for? Like building projects, architectural projects. But juniper wood was very often used for burning. The wood is very aromatic, and like I was mentioning earlier with the Mesopotamians, it was thought that the smoke would purify spaces from evil spirits. So many countries would use juniper wood to purify temples, and specifically a temple where worship and congregation was about to begin. Juniper wood specifically was used during Beltane, which is the summer solstice, and they would put juniper wood in fires to purify cattle and livestock. People would also burn juniper wood in their houses for the 3 days leading up to Beltane to clean their house of unwanted spirits before the celebration. I want more juniper in my life. In both Scotland and parts of the Czech Republic and Slovakia, juniper berries were used to fumigate stables to expel demons and unwanted guests. In fact, they also believed that it aided in clairvoyance. See, there it is again. The smoke was thought to repel invisible forces, and juniper smoke, in fact, does cleanse the air and limits airborne diseases from spreading. So they actually have done research that juniper is antibacterial, and burning the smoke can actually truly cleanse the air of bacterias that can be transferred airborne. And so, I mean, call it what you will, but that sounds like expelling evil spirits to me. So, so just to like get some context into why I chose to do this whole episode on juniper, last year I just got on my one of my weird YouTube tangents, and I ended up watching this Lifeline, I think, or Timeline. I watched this Timeline documentary about Shangri-La, and basically this British fucking dude, he was just some square ass British dude, was traveling around Pakistan and parts of northern India on a search for the lost city of Shangri-La. This city is kind of like a legend, and it is thought that it actually existed, but people aren't sure where. And it was thought to be one of the most prosperous ancient cities of the ancient world, and it's thought to be nestled somewhere in the foothills of the Himalayas. There's a lot of mythology around that area in general, of magic and people living for thousands of years and prosperity, and Shangri-La is sometimes associated with the fountain of youth and having waters that will allow you to live forever. When you really think about it, it's not that crazy because it's really close to Tibet and a lot of the other cultures of the Himalayas where the Buddha was born. Apparently he was born in Gorakhpur, which is in Himachal. And anyway, there is a lot of really interesting mythology from that part of the world that does talk a lot about people living for a long time and having the ability to, quote, use magic or to be able to bend the limits of time and space. I'm not surprised that there would be an alleged ancient city of regalness and magic. And anyway, it's a really interesting documentary. The host, it was kind of like a buster, but it was a really interesting documentary nonetheless. So anyway, in this documentary, this guy is traveling through the Himalayas, and he spends a lot of time in Pakistan, and he ends up going to a really remote village that's kind of in the middle of nowhere, and he has to walk by, there's no road that leads to this village. He has to kind of walk on these cliffs with his little backpack to this tiny village, and he ends up talking to a group of men and the local medicine man or local shaman of the area. And this man was, the day that he meets them, this shaman has an exorcism scheduled. So they let this British guy come with him. And okay, so anyway, wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the people in this area believed that they had fairy-like beings that lived above the snow line. So they're way up in the mountains, but there was a snow line that I think was kind of all year. And so they believed that there was fairies living up there. And the man that they were conducting this exorcism on believed that he had a curse. He had some physical ailments. He basically had a really, really bad flu, but he couldn't get out of bed, and they believed that it was a curse. So The shaman comes into this man's house. He gets like a stainless steel plate and he puts a bunch of juniper branches on it, and he like lights a corner on fire so they create a bunch of smoke, and he puts his head over this plate of smoking juniper branch, and he starts taking really big inhales in through his nose and holding his breath, and he probably takes like around five like really deep inhales of the juniper smoke. And then he immediately like jumps up and he starts like kind of like, I don't know, he kind of starts like noodling around, I think is the best verb I could use. He's like, his body's like noodling, but his spine is pretty stiff, and he kind of starts like making a lot of like yipping noises and kind of like speaking in tongues with a little bit of possibly like Arabic. It sounded like there was maybe some like Muslim prayers. I heard like Allah a couple times, but like don't quote me on that. It was really hard to distinguish if he was actually speaking a language or not for most of the time. And basically he kind of started kneeling down next to this man who is like supposed to be cursed, and he kind of kept jumping up and down, and eventually he like bolts for the door. Like this guy just fucking runs out of the front door. He runs down the front steps of this little house, and they like give him a pickaxe, and he starts digging through the soil right in front of this man's front stoop. And he's digging and digging, and then he finds a piece of skull wrapped in a rag. And in their culture, they believe that this is a curse used by enemies to curse people. And so this is like a well-known curse. What was so interesting about this documentary is that the man, this like British guy who was leading, who was like the documentarian, was commenting on that, how he didn't believe any of this was real. And I got really frustrated because I just feel like it's so disrespectful to go to someone else's culture and then videotape them, to then just be like, you're faking it. Well, like, what would they have to gain from that? Anyway, it was pretty rude. This is why I don't fuck with British cis. He was also blonde. Oh my god, the blondes, am I right? So this is where it gets like a little even like deeper. So this shaman who did the exorcism, after he found the piece of skull in the rag, he runs back inside of this man's house, and he is like still kind of like noodling and jumping, and then he kind of collapses in exhaustion, and he exits his trance-like state. After all this, he like takes a break, but the following day, the village has a yearly prophecy ceremony where they have this shaman again huff the juniper smoke, and he ends up kind of going again into a trance and has like basically guided by the juniper smoke. They believe it gave him clairvoyance, and he would have a dance basically, and the dance and specifically his facial expressions while he danced would give insight into how the upcoming year would be. So while they were watching him dance in this particular ceremony, he was smiling a lot, and he was having like really like graceful movements. So they interpreted that as having a good year of harvest and a good year of slaughter. And literally while he was dancing, they had sacrificed a baby goat. So the shaman, as he's dancing, goes over to a goat that had been sacrificed and picks up the baby goat head, and he starts dancing around with it. His face is facing like the bloody back of the head, and he starts sucking blood from the back of its head while he's like jauntily dancing around. And in their culture, they believe that goat blood is fairy milk, meaning that they would have an extra prosperous year. What I find so interesting about this is the goat sacrifice and the goat blood being associated with fairy milk, because a lot of ancient cultures would actually sacrifice goats, and goats were supposed to be like a symbol of prosperity and wealth, and because they are so helpful and they graze and they can feed so many and they create milk. But it's really interesting to me that eventually Christianity started associating goats with the devil, because so many cultures used to, I don't want to say worship them, but use them while worshiping. And specifically in Judaism, there was a scapegoat tradition where they would set one goat free in the woods and they would push one goat down a cliff as a sacrifice. And I mean, people still use that term all the time, like, don't make whoever your scapegoat or whatever. But these are all like religious practices that now the Christian church has deemed as demonic. And I just find it so interesting. Sometimes I wish I had the ability to look back into time and to witness people just being, because so much of history in the United States has been told from a Christian perspective and from a white cisgendered Christian man's perspective. And sadly, I think they've gotten a lot of the facts wrong. But here I am sounding like a broken record. So, on the vein of juniper having magical properties, this was also widely believed in Europe before widespread Christianity, that juniper had magical properties and could ward off evil. But interestingly enough, when Christianity came into place, juniper was actually still used for magical healing reasons. So, in the plague times, the plague doctors would often wear these really creepy masks that had long pointy noses, almost like crows. It looks like a steampunk made like a crow inspired leather mask. You probably know what I'm talking about. If not, you can Google it. And so these long noses were actually used to stuff with plants, and specifically with juniper leaves, because they thought that the juniper leaves would keep off the disease, and specifically the evil spirits associated with the disease. And later in Spain and other parts of Europe during the Spanish flu, a lot of hospitals were actually spraying juniper oils into the air to prevent airborne infection. What? In other parts of Europe, it is also said that people were using juniper when conducting spells of protection, and as well as spells protecting them from enemies. But it was also used as a manifestation plant because it was so good at keeping away unwanted energies, and you could focus your energy on your intended manifestation. Also, there's a really interesting folk tradition from Europe about the significance of juniper if you were to dream about it. So there's a belief that if you were to dream about a juniper tree, that it's considered unlucky. But I think maybe what they're trying to say is that if you're dreaming about a juniper tree, it means that you may need its healing. Like you may actually have some kind of like evil spirits lurking around you. So to dream about a juniper tree means that you would need the services of a juniper tree, which may or may not be unlucky. It just may mean that you need some healing. But, we all go through cycles. Also, what is so interesting about this is that instead of having a dream specifically about the juniper tree, if you had dreams of collecting the berries from a juniper tree, specifically during the winter, it denoted prosperity. And it also meant that you could possibly soon receive great acclaim as an individual. Also, if a married couple were to dream of the juniper berries, it was believed that it was a foretelling of a male child to come. There's also just like a bunch of, a lot of cultures have different beliefs of the juniper tree. There was a time in Wales where they believed that if you were to cut down a juniper tree, that you would be dead within a year. I found a really interesting story from the Grimm fairy tales, and obviously like the brothers Grimm claimed that the stories that they told were, hundreds and, older than time, hundreds of years old. But the Grimm The Grimm's brothers really did doctor a lot of stories to fit their audiences, but there often was themes that they had borrowed from older stories. And I just thought I would share this story because I think it's really interesting and thematically, and also like it's just really juicy because they always have fucking gruesome stories. So there is a Grimm's brothers story known as the Juniper tree. And in this story, in a nutshell, there was a pregnant woman who ate the berries of a juniper tree outside of her house. And as a result, she became very ill, and she survived just long enough to birth a son. After she died, she was buried under a juniper tree by her husband. And after some time, the husband decided to remarry, and he had a daughter with his new wife. And very quickly, this stepmother became very jealous of the boy, the firstborn, and she desired her daughter to receive the family inheritance instead of the son. So the stepmom one day witnesses her stepson leaning into a chest for an apple. And she gets so angry with him for getting an apple out of this chest, which is pretty petty, but she decides to kill him. So she decapitates him with the lid of the chest, which is so extreme. So she continues to fold the remains of his body into a black pudding dish and serves it to her fucking husband, which is gruesome. The daughter slash sister of the boy buries his bones under the juniper tree outside of their home, next to his mother's bones. And so, after doing so, she witnesses marvels of magic. She sees the bones engulf in a magical flame and then transform into a bird. And the bird, through song, reveals that he is her brother and that he was in fact murdered by her mother. And he, using his song, enchanted her and had her collect tools that he needed for his revenge, one of which included a millstone. So through this magical power that the bird possessed, it was able to lift a giant millstone and crush his stepmother to death. He then transformed back into a human boy and resumed his life of normalcy. Afterwards, they enjoyed a joyous family dinner. Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's just like such a lovely sentiment of a lot of like the Grimm's brothers story is just like violence followed up by like, let's just eat a really nice dinner after killing mom. That's really dramatic. So I actually found a really interesting like alchemical analysis of this story. And so obviously like the brothers Grimm doctored this story for their audience, but I found a really interesting interpretation of some of the themes of this story, which come from alchemy. So basically, like, the death or dismemberment is part of the reconfiguration process, which is a step in alchemy. And then, wait, let me preface this. This is the self-transformation element of alchemy. So there's different schools of thought in what alchemy is, and I actually should do an episode on this. But alchemy can be interpreted in a multitude of ways. Some people take alchemy to mean the distillation of a metal to create gold. It could also mean finding and harnessing a magic je ne sais quoi, trying to use chemistry to use change to create some kind of like life-giving magical thing. It can also be interpreted as self-transformation leading into resurrection, leading into enlightenment, leading into a self-rebirth. So this theme that I'm talking about refers to like a self-rebirth or like kind of like an enlightenment. So basically, the boy's death and dismemberment is the reconfiguration process. He's then cooked in a pot by his stepmom, which symbolizes the womb of transformation, the quote, cauldron of transformation. And then his father eating him symbolizes the stripping of the flesh and the consumption of that flesh by the individual's life guide, right? It's his father. So his own guide, his creator, eats his flesh. And then the flesh and bones of this individual is returned to its ancestors and returned to the world tree, the web of consciousness, which is the juniper tree. His mom was buried under it, his ancestor, and it's the world tree. And then eventually shape-shifting and then reintegration into, quote, normality. So this boy had really gone through all of these steps, which is kind of an allegory for rebirth or coming of age or personal enlightenment, which I found really interesting. A little tidbit, take what you will. So now this is just a fun little side bit, but I thought I would talk about gin. I don't drink. I strongly dislike drinking alcohol, but the history of gin is really interesting, and it's not what I imagined it would be, and so it's worth talking about. So juniper, as we know it today, and specifically gin, which is juniper gin, started to be produced in the 11th century AD, and it was used as a medicinal liquor by monks and alchemists, especially in southern Italy, Flanders, and the Netherlands. And they used it to provide aqua vita. And so aqua vita basically means like the water of life. And it was an ancient term for concentrated ethanol. This is also an alchemical term. The aqua vita, or the water of life, was thought to be crucial as an ingredient for rapid change, or like, right, this enlightenment concept that they're striving for. And so ethanol, because they thought that ethanol was aqua vita, became a common term for distillates of alcoholic beverages, usually prepared by distilling wine, thus creating the spirit of wine, or ardent spirits, which is where spirits come from. So spirits are called spirits because they're believed to actually to have the spirit of the alcohol, because originally it had like religious connotations, and that explains why wine is such a big part of Christianity, and specifically distilled wine. But this is like a slippery slope to be ingesting ethanol. Anyway, so in the 14th century, there was a famous alchemist who fucking loved ethanol. And he believed that it was imperishable and it was life-giving. And he referred to it as the fifth essence, or the quintessence, which is believed to be the fifth element out of the four elements, the first four elements being earth, air, water, and fire. So he was searching for the fifth element, a classic alchemical concept, this ether, this invisible force known as the quintessence. So, fun fact, the word quintessential actually comes from this term quintessence, literally meaning the fifth essence, referring to medieval alchemical concepts of the pure essence latent in all things, a substance of which the heavenly bodies are composed. One of the main goals of alchemy was to extract its fifth essence, or ether. So here I am, been throwing around the word quintessential my whole life. No idea that I'm throwing around an alchemical term. Incredible. So anyway, back to the gin. So monks in Italy were distilling wine and then afterwards adding juniper berry essence into their distilled wine. Because so many of the monasteries in southern Italy were surrounded by juniper trees, and they believed that by adding juniper berries that it would have more of a medicinal purpose, which, I can't blame them. So they were brewing these tonics as medicine, and I mean, honestly, juniper had been used as medicine for hundreds of years at this point, if not thousands of years. So, they just weren't even, it was kind of like a no-brainer. So in France and Italy, this drink originally was referred to as Juniper. And I actually looked up the etymology of the name Jennifer, and it has nothing to do with Jennifer. But I thought it would have been funny if like the name Jennifer actually refers to gin, but it doesn't. So scrap that. So fast forward, so this had started in the 11th century. So fast forward to the 1500s in Europe. A lot of soldiers were actually drinking this before battle, as it was thought to have calming effects. And so there was this term known as Dutch courage, which referred to drinking Juniper and having a courageous experience, because, as I mentioned, the Dutch ended up becoming huge distributors of gin because they were buying so much of it from Scotland and had their own distilleries. So by the mid-17th century, malted barley and wine spirits were very commonly accompanied with juniper berries, anise, caraway, and coriander, and it was sold pharmaceutically as a treatment to help with kidney ailments, lumbago, low back muscle, and neurological issues, stomach problems, gallstones, and gout. Now, all of the herbs, like all of the spices mentioned, I feel like is a great idea. But then like the fact that it was like added to fucking alcohol, it's just pretty fucking wild. But I guess we're doing equally crazy things in the pharmaceutical industry today, so I can't hate. In the 18th century, England allowed unauthorized gin production, which caused a huge rise in the production of gin and the consumption of gin. And at the same time, England also imposed a huge, heavy tax on imported spirits. Oh, but of course. So very naturally, people stopped buying imported alcohol and they started, consuming gin, because at this point, anyone could make it without a permit. And so people were just starting to make a whole bunch of gin and just kind of selling it on the street. And pretty quickly, this became called the gin craze. And as it was cheaper to buy local gin, and many farmers and distillers had a bunch of extra barley that was like too low grade for beer. So because of that, all of this leftover barley was just used to make gin. And very quickly it became referred to gin became referred to as mother's ruin, because so many people were just getting shit-faced out of their minds and dying in the cold, or just becoming like, fucking drunks, and just like, I guess there's a lot of sad moms. And so subsequently, because the death rate increased so much in England, because there were so many people dying in the cold and just being shit-faced full time, England instated the Gin Act of 1736, and this imposed a super high tax on retailers, which led to riots. I just want to point out that, like, the fact that there was riots over taxes on alcohol just, like, goes to show that people care most about getting fucked up than anything else. Classic. Also, Britain was running their country like an actual business, and that just reminds me why the US is the way it is and uses such brutal tactics, because literally all of these decisions are about making money and controlling people, and not necessarily about the health of people. It's about like how to profit from people, which is a very fascinating way to conduct a political system. But here we are in 2022, living the colonial effects of this very nation that I speak of. So by the year 1742, the tax was abolished, the gin tax. But by the time it was 1751, which is like 9 years later, they actually reinstated a different tax, which focused more on forcing distillers to sell only to licensed retailers. And then they would have these licensed retailers under a jurisdiction of local magistrates. And basically, this was like the first liquor license situation. So they created a liquor license so that not anyone could sell the gin. You would have to have a license to sell gin, which again is another way to tax their asses. So, like, I don't know, just like food for thought, taxes don't actually change the problem or like an addiction that people may have. It also doesn't really change the reasons why these people are propelled to like self-medicate and propelled to eventually form addictions. And the living environments of British culture created people who used inebriants to cope from their life, and then the government profited from their coping mechanisms. And I think that's a really big reason why a lot of countries that have been colonized by Europe, but specifically countries that have been colonized by the British, often have very extreme ways of coping with pain and coping with sadness, because England has been running their country like a business for so long that it really takes away from the quality of life of each person living in that place, because everything that you are literally brought into this world and taxed for so many things, and it's pretty heartbreaking and like really fucked up. I like strongly disagree with just like that mode of operation. But anyway, moving on. So by the 18th century, people were getting licensed to produce gin, and they were actually getting licenses to produce in their homes, and they started flavoring it with turpentine to enhance the, quote, woody notes. Turpentine, for those of you who don't know, is fucking paint thinner. So people were putting paint thinner in gin to enhance the woody notes. So we went from like them originally using this like medicinally and to connect with like the idea of being able to ascend into enlightenment to like people just getting fucked up and adding paint thinner to it. I mean, I also assume, I couldn't find any information on this, but like I also assume that by adding turpentine, you were getting like fucking fucked up. Anyway, so during this time in England, the Dutch and Belgian were also producing Juniper, and they were using malt wine. So this technically isn't considered gin like we would call it today. This still falls into the Juniper category, but this is actually a much sweeter drink than gin, because it is made from malt wine. Sometimes this Juniper from Belgium and Holland is sometimes referred to as Old Tom gin. But by the time the 20th century rolled around, it lost a lot of popularity, and the dry gin that we know today was developed in England. And so most of the times, if you ever like buy gin or drink gin, no matter where it was produced, it is inspired by the dry gin that was invented in England around the 20th century. But its roots all boil back down to monks in Italy who were studying alchemy and trying to get fucked up. So, honestly, Juniper does have a lot of health benefits, and so there hasn't been a bunch of research on Juniper because I think people I don't know, I don't want to talk more shit about like scientists. I don't have any problem with the idea of science. I have problems with some of the people who get into the sciences because I think they don't necessarily use critical thinking, which is what science is all about. But it would be cool to do more research on some of the ancient remedies for healing, because if they were used for thousands of years, maybe there's a chance that they work. Just throwing that out there. So in the research that they have done, juniper berries are known to be very high in nutrients and specifically a great source of vitamin C. They are full of antioxidants, volatile oils, and coumarins, and basically all of these are chemical compounds with protective qualities in the cellular form. And so basically they can protect cells by limiting inflammation. So basically a easier way to like digest that is that juniper berries are anti-inflammatories. They have a lot of monoterpenes, which are anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer, antioxidant, and antibacterial properties. So basically these just have like really good properties for your cellular health. And studies have proven that juniper oil reduce cellular damage in yeast cells by increasing the activity of enzymes which protect the cells from radical damage. So long story short, it does have a lot of really fantastic health benefits. I wish and hope that there's some more research done on juniper berries. I would maybe like to get some juniper berry oil. And I guess I just recommend that if you guys, I don't know, I never told you to huff juniper berries, but if you do, I guess do it with someone who is babysitting you so that you're safe. I don't know. Just don't do it at home, kids, but hopefully they can do some more research on juniper. And I just, it is kind of like a really deep symbol that I think is true for a lot of ancient medicines, that the ancient world was using them for spiritual reasons and health reasons, and a lot of those medicines are now being used as recreational drugs. Things that come to mind are mushrooms, alcohol, cocaine. I mean, like, almost every single drug that you can imagine was originally used for more spiritual reasons and in much lower quantities. And now people are using them in much higher quantities, and they're using them to get fucked up in party settings. And I don't know. I guess that's a generalization, but I think there are some really big factors of the modern world that we've created that I don't know if we've really taken the time to examine. But I think most people don't have the capacity to even have a spiritual practice because they're so stressed and so sad that they use medicines as a way to inebriate themselves, to numb themselves from their own pain. And I think that reflects a lot on the choices that we're making as a global society and what responsibilities we impose on individuals, because I think a lot of people are really unhappy, and it's sad to see people, be unhappy and then get fucked up. And I don't know. This is me just pontificating, and I just hope that everyone's taking really good care of themselves. I don't think there's anything wrong with having a drink here and there. I think there's nothing wrong with experimenting with certain drugs, but it does say a lot, just addiction in general, because addiction doesn't always have to be to substances. Addiction can be to people. Addictions can be to emotions. Addictions can be to beliefs. And I think we live in an addict society, and I think we've co-created that over thousands of years. And I don't know where I was going with that, but I just have a lot of this whole juniper subject has made me really think a lot, because how many other things in our modern society do we use on a daily basis, or that we've heard of, that actually have like really deep ancient roots that we just have no idea, that we might just take for granted as just some random plant, but at one point was incredibly revered by our not so distant past. If you know more things about juniper that I didn't cover, please email in at esotericaandnonsense@gmail.com. I want to hear your opinions. I want to hear your suggestions. Is there any other topic that I didn't cover? Please email in at esotericaandnonsense@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a beautiful day. I hope you take care of your beautiful self, and I'll catch you next time.